Well, I'll be talking about today managing contracts from an in-house point of view in an attempt to mitigate disputes. As we've just heard, and I completely agree that we can't avoid disputes completely, but we can try to mitigate. Most of us are lawyers in the room, practicing probably different disciplines, but no matter which discipline we practice, contracts do form a major part of our practice. And I hope you'll all agree with me that whenever I'm looking at a contract, either from a drafting point of view or reviewing, I'm just looking at two primary things. One, whether this serves my business purpose properly, and two, whether I can mitigate disputes, whether I can make sure that there are less and less disputes, and if there are, I'm fine if I have to step in the court of law or any other arbitration or other quasi-judicial proceedings. In my experience, I've seen that there are a lot of complex provisions in a contract. And all of us look at it very, very carefully. A lot of lawyers are looking at it, you're negotiating it, it has been vetted, looked at several times, and generally we get it right. What I've seen so far, that some of the basic things are sometimes just missed out, and that at a later stage become a problem. And that's what you'll see in my next slide, and probably think, really? But it does happen. Not at Coca-Cola, I'm saying, but in my experience so far. Caveat as a lawyer. Have to have disclaimers, right? Parties. Now, we do get the parties right generally. But then what happens if you're looking at a large corporate structure? I have several companies. I've got tax lawyers, I've got litigation lawyers, I've got IP lawyers, and a number of different lawyers working on it, and everyone has one choice of the party. Some lawyers are involved in the negotiation discussion process, some of the disciplines aren't involved. What I've seen, and from my experience, either in-house counsels or sometimes outside counsel who are helping us forget where the underlying rights lie. I choose the right party from a business point of view, perfectly right decision. I choose the right party from a taxation point of view, perfectly right decision. It's my internal company, and I always think, oh, I can perfect the documentation later on because my IP is sitting into another company, but that's fine. It is. And probably you can perfect it at a later stage, but sometimes it just becomes a problem at a later stage when you're into a dispute scenario. And things have changed along the lines, and you don't have the right people available, you don't have sometimes the companies have changed. So that perfection of documents is extremely important. I'm not saying that in companies we need to involve all of the lawyers, but probably an external lawyer or whoever is sitting there drafting it, I look at it very carefully, making sure, probably I'm an IP lawyer, that's the reason why I look at it, but I make sure that the underlying rights are clear and the authorizations are in place no matter how close the companies are. The other one is flow of rights. And I go back to where Virginia was talking about when you're sitting in one location, but you're working across the globe. Now, when you're acquiring rights, probably in Europe or sitting in the US, it's quite easy. But over here, not a lot of people realize that we don't even have a copyright collective society. So and generally we are all about advertising, promotions, and all companies probably at some point acquire these kind of rights. I'm acquiring a song today, and I'm going to go on a large promotion tomorrow. Great. An agency is acquiring rights. Yes, I've perfected it. Everyone's right. I've paid someone in Lebanon. Okay. Is that the right party? Absolutely. You go into a big promotion. 2 days later, you get the demand letter. Were you using my song without my rights? Oh, I paid my agency, and my agency paid someone in Lebanon, but they're not the right people. So That's another thing that one has to be very careful about. And I go back to Virginia's presentation, and I agree that there are cultural things that we need to be careful about, but there are also a lot of peculiar things about jurisdictions that we need to remember and make sure that, which probably if I was working in Europe, I wouldn't even look at. If I have a collective society, perfect, I've paid that, clear, easy. But over here, it's a little bit different. Coming to jurisdiction, and that's another aspect that we just discussed in another presentation. Again, now I'm again talking about, and probably from my experience working for global companies, a choice of jurisdiction not always depends upon my liking. It can be because I have a business interest in a country, I've got my supplier in that country, I'm working in that country, I have to choose the jurisdiction there. Perfect. We can do that, especially when we have no choice on a negotiation table. But my point is that sometimes what happens, and I've seen that happening, that people tend to forget, again, going back, looking into how it works in that jurisdiction. How will my contract ultimately be interpreted? What kind of clauses that I have to add in to probably my standard contract to make sure that it actually works in that particular jurisdiction? So choice of jurisdiction can either be my choice, or it can be something that's actually not my choice, but I have to choose that for whatever reason. But I would look at it very carefully to just make sure, and especially in our regions, because I for instance, cover 45 countries in the Middle East and North Africa region and Africa region, to make sure that my contract, my clauses are right as per that jurisdiction. That may be a little bit more costly, a little bit more time consuming, but I think if a dispute arises, it'll be very helpful if I've done that homework right. Exclusivities, again, coming from my presentation is a little bit IP heavy, probably because I am an IP lawyer. That the business would come to you, or if you're working as an outside counsel as well and dealing with a business person, they'll come back to you and say anything. Sometimes you have to also carefully look at, and I think someone also mentioned knowledge of the industry. What works in my industry? And on top of that, how does my business work? Does my business, I tend to very carefully look at their history, how they work. If they choose a particular product or brand, if they launch it in a market, what do they do a year later? What happens? And I learn a lot from that. And when they come up to me and say, well, we want this exclusive clause, or we want it non-exclusive, say, well, going back to our previous experience, it may not be the best thing to do. And then adding the relevant exclusions. So sometimes it's probably not right to just listen to the business with a close eye and just have the industry knowledge, but also having the background knowledge is very helpful of how a business is actually functioning, especially in different jurisdictions, because businesses function in a very different way in different jurisdictions. And I completely agree on that with Virginia, and how culture and how the local customs may impact how business is done in the countries. And that ultimately affects our contracts and disputes. I think most people would agree, and if you don't, let me know. In my experience, most disputes arise out of non-clarity in the agreements, when the scope itself is not carved out properly. What do you want to deliver, or what do I need delivered, or what you can deliver, and what my expectations are? And sometimes I feel within those expectations, some are completely negotiable. For instance, time frame, I may have some threshold. Sometimes I absolutely don't have a threshold, which I can add in a contract, but sometimes we do have a threshold. And what I like doing is creating that threshold for me to be able to go back to the business at that point before a dispute arises to find a resolution, because at that point, I know I've given a soft deadline, and I know, and I have a provision in the contract for a hard deadline between those to find a resolution without it becoming a dispute and me going into litigation or trying to resolve it from any other way. So that's a commercial space for me to then find a resolution so we don't get into a dispute scenario. Building relationships, I think, are extremely important. And in my experience, they really work very well if you have good relationships with your suppliers or with your business partners. I do agree that you would say, well, if you didn't have good relationship, why did you actually enter into a contract in the first place? Absolutely right. When we enter into a contract, we generally have the relationship of trust. But down the line, if that trust is not nourished, it can lead to disputes, and it can lead to issues between two parties, which will ultimately create problems for us or probably land us in the court. So that client commercial relationship is very important from a contract, from a business point of view as well. Timely due diligence. This is another thing that I generally tell my clients that we must look into, even for our business partners that we've been dealing with for years, and when you're looking at a new contract, when you're looking at a renewal, what their history has been, both with us and with their other business partners. What is their litigation history? What is their dispute history? What is their business ethics history? Let alone what due diligence we've done from other point of view, which most companies anyway do, especially multinationals. But from a business point of view, what have they been doing in the market? Because that really helps to incorporate then the relevant provisions in the contract to, again, sometimes you may receive some information about an issue, and that doesn't mean that I'm not going to have a business relationship with this party, because sometimes, especially speaking in my jurisdictions, you may not have an option. But then you do have an option to correct it through your contract and have the relevant provisions in the contract to correct whatever background history that you have that, while they've done that in the past, it may happen in the future, and I may have a possibility to correct it at this stage while I'm entering into a relationship with them. Providing targeting trainings, again, it goes back to my building relationships point, that when you're building relationships, when you have that, when I was talking about that gap between my soft deadline and my hard deadline, when I see an issue, don't let it go. And that's what I talk to my business about. Don't let it go. Look at the issue, and we're partnering with a party. They can be in breach, and if they are in breach, it's a problem for you, it's a problem for us. So, and if it's a possibility for us to provide them the trainings, provide them to the support and help at that point, then that can help us mitigate any disputes or problems or litigation at a later stage, which can be very, very expensive for both parties. Another point is expecting change. We are very technologically savvy these days. And your business would come to you and say, well, I can enter into a 2 years, 3 years, 4 years contract. Things may change along the line, both from a technology point of view, from a market point of view. Our markets are different. Look at Middle East. Things can change overnight. What provisions do we have? If I have a 4 years term, and things change in the meantime, my deliverables change, my expectations change, my interest may change, then what happens? So I think we need to be very careful about that possibility of change, and then probably having some provisions. Sometimes, where possible, probably having an escape clause where the contract doesn't damage either party, and you can still have a proper business interest fulfilled, where if an escape from that contract helps, then that's what helps for the business. Now, again, it's the last slide, and talking about housekeeping, and it does happen. Believe me, it's you have a contract negotiated over months. You've done everything right from the preamble to the signature clause. You keep it aside. 5 years later, take out the contract. Oh, it's only been signed by one party. And it does happen. I think that's another little thing that one must keep in mind, and it's probably more for an in-house counsel like me to make sure that it's properly executed. Everything is right in the contract. I have the required originals, and And then my next point, that I retain those originals. Sometimes when you're working with a smaller organization, they probably don't have resources, and I'm talking about a long-term contract now to retain it for 20 years, and it just gets lost in the time. It also happens with the large organizations where you have a corporate structure with companies sitting in Ireland, in the US, in Europe, in the Middle East. Some contracts go somewhere, the others go somewhere else. If you don't have a tracking mesh, when a possibility of tracking them, a dispute arises. Or, again, going back to my trademark experience, for instance, a trademark assignment agreement, which assignment hasn't been recorded in time, looking for it years later, you just can't find the original. Very important in our jurisdictions, again, and going back to my point that the jurisdiction you're working in is extremely important, and for us, retaining these originals are very important. The next one, and the last point on my slides today, is the expiry dates. And again, I've seen that happening in my professional lifetime. Is that there's a long-term contract. We sign the contract, we are all happy with it, the contract's kept on a side, business is running, we're both happy with each other. One day, the business would come up to you and say, look, there's a problem, and we need to terminate this relationship. Okay, let me go back to the contract. Somehow you dig down, find the contract. Oh, it actually expired 2 years ago. What do you do now? What happens to all my rights? What happens to the business that they've been doing for 2 years now? And it does happen in smaller or larger organizations. So I think keeping those tracking dates handy is very useful as well. I think that's all I had to say today. Thank you so much, and have a Coke.